What is going on, you sons of bitches? Welcome to Create and Destroy. I'm your host, Dan Donnarumma. This is episode 38. We're closing down the waning days of 2019. Pretty wild year, pretty wild fucking decade. Very excited about today's guest in today's episode. So I was fortunate to have Ryan Hall on the podcast, and Ryan is just an all-around good dude. He runs Whited Sepulchre Records. He books shows. He does a podcast called Tome to the Weather Machine. He also posts some reviews and some really cool stuff on his website. So he's just an all-around good fucking guy, really into music. And in speaking with him, that became very, very apparent very, very quickly. What also became very apparent was how much of a fucking nice guy that he is. I've had multiple people on the show, whether they've mentioned during our interview or after we've finished recording, that they know Ryan and just how much of a fucking nice guy he is. And I could tell you guys, he is a super nice fucking dude. So I'm really glad that I was able to get him onto the podcast and pick his brain. If you're unfamiliar with Whited Sepulchre Records, it's a really cool record label, and Ryan puts out a lot of really cool stuff. So I discovered Whited Sepulchre 2017, I think it was. Ryan put out a split release with Planning for Burial and Sister Grotto, which if you have not listened to that split, I would highly suggest it. Planning for Burial's song in that split, and Sister Grotto, who's also goes by Midwife, her song in that split is fucking fantastic. And later that year, Whited Sepulchre also released Midwife's formidable LP, Like Author, Like Daughter. But he also puts out a bunch of really great experimental stuff and just a wide variety of experimental, punk, ambient, and really great music. When I spoke to Ryan, he had mentioned that, he hopes that with Whited Sepulchre, people could get a sense that, he's got a good finger on the pulse to cool shit and good music, and I would say that he definitely does. There's several record labels currently that I get excited by and that I think are really putting out some fantastic releases, and Whited Sepulchre is right up there. I spoke to Ryan about starting the record label, music being very integral to his life, and we also talked about some of the releases that he's released this year, Hissing Tiles and the Drowse and AMULETS split specifically, but then I also had to talk to him about the Midwife, Like Author, Like Daughter release, because the more we get further away from when I first experienced that album, the more that album has become such an important album to me and one of my all-time favorite albums. It's so goddamn good. So I had to talk to Ryan about that release and getting to work with Madeline Johnson. Also, today is Ryan's birthday. So December 10th is Ryan's birthday. So every one of you that are listening should bombard him with well wishes and birthday wishes. So happy birthday, Ryan. So let's get right to it, guys. Here's my conversation with Ryan Hall. So Ryan, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast. Very excited to have you on. Before we get started, there's a few things I wanted to talk about. So I mentioned this to Hissing Tiles when I spoke with them, but there's been people that I brought onto the podcast or just in conversations with other folks where you got love out on the streets, man. People seem to be really into you, man.
People are very kind. I heard that Lacing interview where they shouted me out. So yeah, people are too kind.
Yeah, they got love for you out on the streets, dude. And the other thing I wanted to mention was I was super pumped to have you onto the podcast because it was so easy to prepare questions for you because you do so much shit, dude. So I was like, oh, this is going to be easy. I'll have so much stuff to talk to him about.
Yeah, it's too much. It's too much.
And that was one of the things I wanted to ask you because you run Whited Sepulchre Records, you book shows, and then you do a podcast. So is there ever times where you're like, fuck, this is just too much, things are too chaotic for me?
Pretty much on a weekly basis. I also work 2 jobs, and so it's it's a lot, but I don't know how to sit still. So I've been able to find a relatively good work-life balance. But yeah, I wouldn't know any other way.
I was having a conversation with a friend of mine last night. Like when I come home, I have to have something to do. I can't sit still. Like my mind has to be occupied. Are you the same way?
Yeah, I think I've kind of been on this treadmill for so long of just always having something that kind of needs to get attended to that it's really difficult for me to, sit down and watch a movie anymore or something like that. But this year I've really tried to pare back. And so I have found time to, binge watch Netflix shows and just kind of hang out and not be glued to my phone and not be kind of thinking about the next thing. But I mean, I think at the core of like my personality, and I think other people, like us who have kind of multiple things going on, there is sort of that drive to not be bored or to kind of stay busy. So yeah, I think I've pared back a bit, but it's still there.
Nice. Are you watching any good shows right now?
I am deep into the Great British Bake Off.
Dude, so my wife has been watching that, and she'll typically watch that when I'm like editing or doing like playing video games or some shit. And there's been a couple of times where like I stop what I'm doing to kind of see what's going on with that show, because I also like Chopped. And I feel like I like the Great British Bake Off so much more because they're so much nicer and friendlier than on fucking Chopped.
It really kind of makes me feel that the world is okay. Yeah, it's a really beautiful show, and so and I can kind of come in and out of it, and watch some people make some pretty amazing stuff, and just like genuinely be kind to one another.
Hell yeah, man!
So other than that, I mean, I'm intrigued by the new Watchmen show.
Oh my God, dude, it's so good.
Yeah. So
are you all caught up on that series?
Yeah, I am. And I actually just reread the Watchmen last week just to kind of it was very rewarding to do that because you kind of catch little things in the show that are a direct reference to the comic book or to the graphic novel.
Oh my God, there's like so many little Easter eggs and shit. It's incredible, man. That is probably my favorite show right now. It's so goddamn good.
It's good.
So, dude, you currently live in Cincinnati. Did you grow up in Cincinnati?
No, I've lived in Cincinnati for about 6 years, which counting where I grew up, which is I grew up in Denver, but since 18, this is like the longest I've ever lived in one place. So yeah, grew up in the outskirts of Denver, kind of middle of the road suburbia, just like southwest of Denver.
When did you leave Colorado and head to the East Coast?
Right. So I, moved away for college when I was 18, kind of bounced around a bit. I went to school in Idaho, and then I lived in Seattle for a while. And then I eventually finished my undergrad at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City, and then moved to, I got married and joined the Peace Corps. So I was in Swaziland, Africa for 2 years, and then came to Cincinnati for grad school.
Wow, dude. And then you just wound up settling in Cincinnati?
Yeah, we love it. We bought a house, and we really kind of put down roots here. It's a great city.
That's awesome, man. Do you ever miss Colorado at all or no?
I do sometimes. My mom still lives there. So I get to go back and visit often, and it's cool. Denver's way different than when I grew up. Just in the past 10 years is just, I mean, the city is almost unrecognizable from when I was living there.
A friend of mine and my wife's, he grew up in Colorado. He moved out to the East Coast for college, so kind of like you. And now he and his wife are back in the Denver area. And we went there and visited them this summer. And he was just saying how different it's been since he's gotten back.
Yeah, Denver's, a newer kind of Western city, so there isn't so much architecture that they need to preserve, so they can just basically bulldoze entire blocks and put up those kind of modular new apartment, condos that go for like, $300,000, $400,000.
Yeah. Man, I gotta say though, my wife and I are into camping and hiking, so Colorado's like one of my favorite states. It's so incredible.
Yeah, there's a reason why so many people want to move out there. It's really
white person
beautiful.
Wakanda, man. It's so true.
It really is.
Being that you're currently in Cincinnati, what's the music scene like there?
I love Cincinnati's music scene. So when I moved out here, there was a really, really thriving DIY scene with a lot of non-traditional venues that were operating, and there's a really great noise scene here. Just I think in the Midwest in general, a lot of harsh noise. There was a inexplicably great breakcore scene, so like digital hardcore, which kind of like skirts the line of like really really harsh techno and noise, but still very much like rooted in like punk and hardcore. There's a couple people doing really cool ambient stuff out here, and then just a lot of kind of good sort of weirdo rock bands like Hissing Tiles and, a couple of other people kind of in that ilk.
I love the term like weirdo rock, like such a good term.
Yeah.
So you book shows, man, and how long have you been booking shows for?
So I've been booking shows basically since I've moved to Cincinnati, and it just happened really kind of organically. A friend hit me up for a show after learning that I moved to Cincinnati, and I was just kind of like, yeah, I guess I could do that. And I didn't really know anybody. I just moved to Cincinnati, so it was a really great kind of excuse for me to go out and meet people who are making music. Actually, the first show that I booked was in my apartment, and then since then it's been kind of a pretty steady stream of people coming through who I've been able to set up shows for. Last year I did 24 shows, which is, insane. And so this year I've really tried to pare back. But one nice thing about buying a house is that we have a lot of room and pretty nice accommodations for folks who are coming through. We have a guest room with a bed that people can sleep in and stuff. So that's been really nice. I've also been involved in booking and kind of curating and running 2 experimental music festivals. One was the Gold Rush Music Festival, which ran from about 2011 to 2015 in Denver, which I did with my good buddy Crawford Filio, who now lives in Chicago. And then for the past 2 years, I've helped kind of as like an assistant festival director put on the Columbia Experimental Music Festival in Columbia, Missouri, with some really good friends of mine who live out there. So yeah, I mean, I've kind of gotten the hang of, booking and putting on shows here, and it's been amazing to kind of do that in other cities and kind of a bigger profile in terms of like a festival.
That's awesome, man. What was that show like that you booked for the first time in your apartment?
It was a lot of fun. I didn't know a whole lot of people, and so it was pretty small, but the people who came out were a dedicated crew who I'm still friends with today. So yeah.
So did you wind up booking shows over the course of your like tenure in that apartment?
I ended up doing 2, and then I've done a handful at my house just here, just kind of very small, little intimate living room shows.
That's fucking cool, man. So being that you book so many shows, can it be a pain in the ass sometimes?
Oh, 110%. There's nothing fun or really rewarding about booking. I think a lot of it is just, for me, it's learning how to say no. Because I figure there's a couple of me in like every city where it's just like, oh yeah, I know people who know people, and so let's hit up Ryan if we're coming, anywhere through Ohio, and a lot of times I'm pretty down to book stuff, but a lot of this year has just been learning to say no and realizing that's okay.
Yeah, I'm sure, man. So, dude, clearly music is a very integral part of who you are in your life. So do you remember the first band that you listened to where you were really captivated, blown away by, and that made you fall in love with music?
Absolutely. I remember very, very clearly and distinctly that experience. I believe I was like 8 years old, and my family had just bought a CD player, which was still at that time like pretty kind of new and like novel technology. And my dad bought the Neil Young record Harvest Moon, which is, I mean, just such a beautiful record. Like the title track Harvest Moon is like one of the most beautiful pieces of music I've ever heard. But I remember listening to that record, and I heard this song called War of Man, which is this Neil Young song that talks about kind of like, it's about nuclear war, but it kind of talks about the effects of war on like animals. And so I remember listening to that and being absolutely like terrified by the song, because it uses a lot of war imagery and stuff like that, and just realizing that like music can kind of in a vicarious way make me feel feelings that are like horror and, this sense of darkness, but intrigue, but in a safe way that like it's a self-contained thing. So it really kind of helped me identify what those feelings were early on. So that was a really meaningful listening experience, just kind of like pulling myself up to the speaker and just like listening to that, like mesmerized. Also, Garth Brooks in Lonesome Dove is a huge song for me. I believe that's off of the album Roping the Wind. I could be wrong though, but it's a story. It's like a story. It's like a country song that's like, tells a story of this woman who like takes revenge for this guy who shot her husband. It's a really, really cool song, and it just kind of paints this really like cinematic picture. So those two songs early on, like when I was like maybe 8 or 9, were huge for me.
What was Garth Brooks' like alter ego? Didn't he have like
Chris Gaines?
Yeah, that's right. That's right, dude.
I love Chris Gaines.
Does he still do that? Do you know?
I wish. I think we're due for a Chris Gaines, reboot or a Chris Gaines reunion.
And like, what was the deal with Chris Gaines? Was that like his more like edgy alter ego?
So he had a soul patch.
Oh my god!
And then like a swoop haircut. And it was kind of like a rap rock thing.
Oh my god!
It was edgy.
Amazing. So, dude, at what point did you start getting into like underground DIY music?
Yeah. So good question. I think that was right as I was getting into middle school. I made friends with a kid with a Dead Kennedy shirt. And he made me a couple of like really crucial like mix CDs that had a lot of like just a kind of like early like US punk. And then in high school so that was like a really big thing for me. And then in high school on a whim I bought Braid. Do you know that band Braid?
Mm-hmm, yep.
Yeah, so I bought it's called Movie Music by Braid, and that just like set me into a whole world of getting super into Midwestern emo. And so then when I first started like listening to like what can be considered like ambient music, I think I was introduced to kind of early stuff by like Brian Eno and like Steve Roach and stuff like that. But I remember I was at a record store in Littleton, which is where I grew up, and I was talking to this record store clerk, and he's like, we were talking about some bands we liked. We were talking about like Botch and like Converge and ISIS, and he's like, "Have you heard this album? It is it's like an Aaron Turner side project called Ever Lovely Lightning Heart." And I'm like, "No, I'll listen to it though." And so it's like a 40-minute long side-long composition by Aaron Turner that it's so weird. I mean, it goes from like really beautiful piano stuff to like soundscapes to like just harsh noise, and I never heard anything like that before. And so that really just kind of like put me down a pretty steep rabbit hole into kind of exploring ambient music and noise and just kind of what could be considered just broadly experimental music. That's
really cool, man. Do you remember the first show that you went to?
I do. I remember the very first show I went to. I think it was 2001. I had just gotten my license, and so I drove to downtown Denver, and this bill was amazing. It was Thursday, Saves the Day, and Hey Mercedes. And I walked in. I'd never been to a show before, and I walked in right during the opening chords of Thursday's Autobiography of a Nation. And Jeff Rickley, I walked in like right as that was playing, and then Jeff Rickley jumps off the stage into the crowd like on the beat, and I was just like, I love everything about this. Like, I'm like the kids smoking cigarettes outside, like the smell of the venue. This is when you could like smoke inside. Just like everybody like wearing band t-shirts. I'm like, oh my God, this is it. Like, this is it. So yeah, went to a lot of shows in high school, just like the ones that had all ages. And at that time, there was a pretty cool all ages scene, in Denver at a couple of all ages venues. Planes Mistaken for Stars were, playing, like house shows in Boulder. So yeah, it was just a really good time to, be a kid and have access to seeing amazing concerts at, all ages venues.
So I cannot remember my first show, but for me, it was probably around the same time, like 2000, 2001. I was probably like 14 or 15 years old. So my mom or like my friend's mom would have to pick us up, drop us off and pick us up because none of us were old enough to drive. One of the earliest shows that I could remember was going to see a 25 to Life show. And
oh my God.
And so like, of course, Rick to Life had his like fucking distro of like stuff that he ripped. And I can't remember if the Earth Crisis album is actually called Gomorrah Season's End, but it's that album with that song on there. Mm-hmm. And it was completely this guy just like straight up burned the fucking CD, like photocopied the cover and sold it to me for like $10 or something like that.
Of course. I love that you saw Ricky or 25 to Life as like an impressionable youth.
Yeah, dude. And I remember like being, like I said, 14 or 15 years old and thinking that it was awesome. And now being like, man, that band sucks. So at this point in time, right, as you're starting to get into like DIY underground music, punk music, were you going to a lot of shows at this point?
As much as I could as a teenager. It wasn't until I really moved to Salt Lake City that I I really prioritized like going to as many shows as I could. Salt Lake, so that's where I did my undergrad, and there at that time, I don't know how things are now, but just an amazing DIY experimental music community there, with a lot of people that I met that I'm still friends with today, that I've put out records by, even down to like last month. So yeah, there's just something really kind of magical in the air during that time of like kind of like 2008 to 2006 to like 2008, 2009 of just some really amazing ambient and kind of like beat-oriented experimental stuff in Salt Lake City. So that's really kind of where I really prioritized trying to, just go to every single show that I could. There was a handful of venues and house venues that were just like really kind of forward-thinking and just kind of booked whatever. So yeah, it was during that time that I really kind of made that a large part of my life.
At this point, did it ever dawn on you, or had the thought come up at all about starting a record label, or did that come later on?
No, so around that time, I had started a music blog called Tome to the Weather Machine, which is the podcast that I still run to this day. And so I always knew that I wanted to be involved in music, but I knew that I wasn't good at making it. And so I wanted to be involved in some way. And so, I started the blog at that time. And I was writing for a handful of music publications at that time, kind of I was writing for kind of what was like the, alt weekly of like Salt Lake, doing music reviews. So yeah, finding and scouting out and just, immersing myself in as much music as possible was something that was really important to me, and something that I knew I really wanted to prioritize.
And so at what point did you wind up starting Whited Sepulchre?
To kind of back up a little bit, when I got home from the Peace Corps in I think 2013, I had started a smaller, just Bandcamp only digital label called Helligator Records that was really kind of more of like a nonprofit. One of the things that we had done there is we had helped renovate a couple of derelict buildings. We mostly worked at a refugee camp when we were in Swaziland. We just happened to live like literally right down the street from one. And so we'd kind of like helped set up this library, and then I wanted to have a way to continually fund that library and pay like, try to pay the wage of the person who is running the library. And so setting up Helligator kind of allowed me to do that, and allowed me to work with a lot of really great artists who would donate tracks basically for the cause. And so that lasted for about 2 years. The library itself actually kind of sustained itself for those 2 years, and then later became part of like the overall operating budget of the refugee camp. So it really kind of found a way to sustain itself. And we were just back there in August, and it's still up and running, and it's still being really well utilized.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So it was really cool. So it was a good opportunity for me to kind of, test the waters and just doing like a digital thing. Got to work, like I said, with like a bunch of really, really cool people. And so a lot happened in the year of 2015 to 2016 that I think directly impacted my decision to start a label. So there's just a lot happening. I had grown up very, very, very religious in my kind of my early, childhood and my early adult life. I was very religious, and kind of had a religious, an anti-religious awakening, I guess, where all of a sudden, like, everything that I believe just kind of like, I kind of squared with the fact that I didn't believe it, and I had never really believed it. It was just something that I kind of did because my family did, and it was kind of culturally expected of me, and music had a big, part in that. And so I kind of, come to this big realization. I, was in the process of sort of like, in some ways kind of coming out to my parents that, like I didn't believe in, religion or really God anymore. And then my dad passed away like really, really unexpectly, just of like a freak heart arrhythmia, just like totally out of the blue. And so during that time, I like really, really fell back hard on music being something that was really being helpful as like a processing tool of hearing these artists, pouring all of this really kind of negative or like hurt into these songs and producing something really beautiful. And so a friend of mine had approached me, my friend Braeyden, with an album, and basically said like, hey, I would love for you to put this out. And I'm like, I don't have a label. And he's like, well, maybe you should start a label. And so I thought pretty heavily about that. And I remember I was on a run. So I was like running, and right behind my house in Cincinnati, there is one of the, it's like the second largest cemetery in the country. It's this really beautiful, cemetery with these really ornate like mausoleums and sepulchres and stuff like that. And so I was on this run, and I was listening to that Braeyden J record, the Fog Mirror, which would later become Fog Mirror. And I was running past all these like really beautiful sepulchres and mausoleums. And there's this phrase in the Bible that Jesus uses to basically like call out hypocrites. He says like, "You're whited sepulchres. On the outside, you're beautiful, but on the inside, you are full of rotting flesh and dead man's bones." And I always thought that was like a fire diss by Jesus. I was just like, and I love like the imagery of like rotting flesh and dead man's bones, being inside this like beautifully like ornate tomb. And so I was thinking about that, and I was also thinking about the music that I was listening to, both kind of ambient music in general, how, it's hard for us to tell what the inputs are for ambient music, right? What could start out as like a C chord, after it's like put through a bunch of pedals and effects and processing, comes out as like this like huge like oceanic wash of like noise and sound. And so while we don't know kind of what the inputs are, the output itself is like very, very beautiful. And so I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about the record that Braeyden had sent me. And so on the output itself is very beautiful, but the input came from like a really kind of dark place in his life. And so I was just kind of thinking about that, and thinking about, just like the role of music, of just kind of being able to pour something that is causing you pain or causing you hurt, and being able to kind of like put that through a series of processors and ringing that through kind of all the feeling and emotion you can muster, and then the output being something like really beautiful and kind of helpful and, in some way beneficial for people in their life. And so, and just kind of like reflecting on, I'd kind of been holding it together really well. I literally just started a new job 2 weeks before. We literally just bought a house 2 weeks before. On the outside, I was like holding it together really, really well. my brother had just gotten married. Like, all this happened within 2 weeks. My brother had gotten married, and my dad was supposed to officiate. And so I stepped in. So I was able to, like, officiate my brother's wedding. I was, like, just really, like, holding it together. And that night, I was over at my friend Alex Cobb's house, who runs the label, Students of Decay. And we were just talking about, the label and kind of what that would take. And I remember I got really, really fucked up. Just like, I had kind of been holding it together. I got just really, really, really drunk and like really, really stoned, and just ended up throwing up like off his balcony, just like, and it being like one of the most like cathartic experiences I've ever had, of just letting it all out, and then kind of like walking away, just like being like, you know what, like, I feel like really good about this decision now of running this record label and kind of adding, to, my plate, which is already pretty full. But I almost kind of felt in some ways, indebted to like the music that had kind of helped me get through this really tough time, to be able to really try to champion and push music that I feel is, really beneficial just in general for people who might be kind of also going through a tough time, or who just might want to feel something beautiful, or just, to help them process what they're going through.
That's incredible, man. I'm just sitting here picturing you like throwing your brains up and just be like, yeah, you know what? I am going to start a fucking record label.
Yeah, no, it was like, we were talking about that, then the night went, and then like I walked away, like, you know what? No, I'm going to start that record label. Not like doing it like as like a drunk like decision, but like having a lot of clarity. Just like, no, like that's what I'm going to do.
Fuck yeah. And so what year was this?
This was 2016, because then that's when I put out that Brain J record.
When you finally came to the decision that you were going to start a record label, and now you're working towards making it happen, what's going through your head at this point? What kind of emotions were you dealing with? What struggles were you dealing with at this point in time?
I mean, it's running a record label is like fucking expensive. And so just a lot of, just logistical concerns. My background, my professional life is I'm a social worker and a therapist. And so my like business acumen or learning, like a budget and stuff like that is stuff that I had to learn really, really quick, and it wasn't always super easy. So yeah, just a little bit of stress and anxiety about, my ability to essentially run like a small business, on nights and weekends, and just the hope that I break even.
And so when you were starting the label, what types of albums, what types of bands were you hoping to work with?
So I kind of had that first record, already ready to go. And so a lot of my output has kind of been in that ambient drone realm, but I'm really, I've really tried to be intentional that like that's not what Whited Sepulchre is. Putting out the Hissing Tiles record, it's a completely different thing. Like it's the opposite of like ambient, kind of calming, music. So I really wanted it to be sort of a big tent label where I think for a little while I kind of got pigeonholed, but I really am, and especially in my 2020, doing everything I can to kind of get outside of that like ambient drone world, and put out some just stuff that I find just really worthwhile and meaningful.
That's really great, man. And so when you were getting the label together, were there any labels that you were really into at this point in time that was inspiring you and what you would hope to achieve with the label?
Yeah, there's a bunch of labels that I follow and still follow that I really try to model sort of like I don't know business practices, but just there's a lot of stuff that I really liked the labels like Geographic North, out of Atlanta, Orange Milk, out of, Columbus and Dayton. The people who run it are good friends of mine. Students of Decay, is another label that I really aspired to. And then, this label that unfortunately is no longer around, but it's called Pathetic Records. It was out of Asheville. They're record labels that put out a whole bunch of variety of different stuff. But I knew that I wanted to listen to whatever they put out because I trusted, what they put out, and they weren't sort of like pigeonholed into a certain genre.
One of the things that I have really grown to love and appreciate about doing this podcast is it has allowed me to kind of learn and kind of get rid of some of the naive thoughts that I had about music and punk and DIY music before this. You know, obviously listening to punk and DIY music, I knew that there would be some bands that aren't making money, but I kind of thought that more bands or more artists, labels were making more money than I thought.
No.
And come to realize, like, dude, that's not necessarily the case. And the people who are making music and the people that are putting their music out, like, it's a love thing, and they're lucky if they could break even.
It is a fucking labor of love. Like, yeah, it is not and especially in 2019, it is not a financially lucrative business to be in.
Oh my God, yeah, I'm sure. So I want to talk about some of your label's recent releases, because some really great stuff, man. You recently put out the Drowse and AMULETS split, which is awesome. How did you wind up working with those two artists to release that split?
One nice thing about running a blog essentially for 10 years is making contacts with artists, especially when they're really early on starting out. So I had the real fortunate pleasure to review Kyle Bates' Drowse's first couple of records that he was just, putting out as a solo Bandcamp release, and just being so impressed by those records. The same thing for Planning for Burial. I think the first time I covered Tom's work was a split that he did with Lone Summer, God, a long time ago. And so just being able to kind of see, artists progress and just like find an audience, but also like really define their sound over a couple of years has been really cool. So I knew Kyle from those early Drowse releases when he sent me those for review, and we just kind of kept in touch over the years. And then Randall AMULETS, it was the last year that we were doing Gold Rush in Denver, which is the music festival that I helped run. And, we have people, emailing us all the time, like, hey, we'd love to play your festival and stuff like that. And most of the time, we already have the lineup, pretty down. And then he emailed us, and, I remember it was just a totally cold, call email. And I remember listening to his work, and I'm just like, oh my God, this is like amazing stuff. And so he was like the first artist, I think one of the few artists ever that were just like, yeah, come play our festival. Like didn't know him, totally like reached out to us. And he's another artist who I've just like really seen just totally hone his craft, and his music has just gotten just so good, and just like he's really just perfected sort of like those like, really kind of lo-fi but like overdriven guitar lines, that just kind of like cut through like all this like really cool like tape loop stuff, and he just ended up being just a good hang. Like Randall was like, he's funny and down to earth and just like super easy to get along with. So I booked him again at the Columbia Experimental Music Festival, and yeah, just a super super good guy, and so fun and easy to work with.
That's cool, man. Yeah, that split is fucking awesome. And I have to say, man, I love the name AMULETS. I think that's such an awesome like moniker.
Yeah. I honestly didn't know what to expect. Yeah, it really kind of fits what he's doing.
I want to thank you, man, for letting me know about Hissing Tiles, because I had never heard of them before you had given me the heads up on their music. And Boychoir is such a freaking awesome album. I was able to have the guys on the podcast, which was awesome. So during my conversation, Eric from the band mentioned that he had reached out to you and asked you to check out the album and see if you were maybe interested in putting that album out. Is that something that happens very often, where artists or bands are reaching out to you and saying, hey, we have this, would you be interested in potentially putting it out?
Yeah, it happens in waves. I think every release cycle I get a lot more emails of people saying like, hey, do you want to put on my record and stuff like that. Hissing Tiles I'd obviously known about, and I was a huge advocate of just within Cincinnati. I thought they were like the most interesting and like best rock band in Cincinnati. And so when he reached out to me, it was another sort of impulsive decision that I don't regret at all. There was just it was a very easy like, yes, like I would love to put out this record.
That's awesome, man. And I have to say, like, I love when bands and albums have something to say, and that album has a really great message, we'll say. A lot of really cool things that they're saying in that album, and it's fantastic.
Yeah, I really love that interview you did with them, and I was really appreciative that you pushed them a little bit to talk about it, because it is, I mean, like, those songs have a lot to say, and I know that, like, kind of halfway through they were like, oh my god, like, we don't want to be sort of like spokespeople or like, you know, like something like that for these, you know, for these issues. But, you know, that album, like, it really does have some really, really important stuff to say about just the current political landscape, toxic masculinity, and just, you know, like gender policing and stuff like that I think are important stuff. And so I really like that interview.
Thank you. Yeah. And I had mentioned this to the guys when we were talking, but I love the fact that they're talking about these, we'll say, heavy kind of topics and issues, but they're framing them in these like vignettes, which I think makes it is so much more impactful, and it carries more weight because of that, as opposed to just saying, you know, toxic masculinity fucking sucks. So I really think the album is a solid album. With your releases, how, like, what would you say the percentage is of bands or artists contacting you and asking you to put that album out, or you discovering an artist and maybe reaching out to them?
Oh, yeah. So I would say most of the artists that I've put out stuff by, I've had previous relationships with. There have been a couple of people who've reached out to me that I've, you know, said yes to putting out their stuff. A lot of times, you know, the people that I'm working with are either, you know, friends of mine or kind of friends of friends, who I've, you know, listened to their music for a while. One exception is the record that I'm putting out next month by this artist, Nicole Oberl. I discovered her music and, you know, just through Bandcamp, and just like another sort of impulsive decision that I don't regret at all. Just emailing her and being like, hey, I want to put out like your next tape. Like, let's work together. I think your music is so beautiful. So yeah, so it's a combination. A lot of times it's, you know, folks who I know who, you know, there's already kind of a personal relationship and a level of trust that's there.
Nice. I have to ask you, because you just stirred this thought in my brain. I totally dislike that outlets will release their top albums of the year list like in November or even before the year ends. And who was it? Was it Decibel that like within the last few weeks released their list? All right, we're in November now. So when I saw that list, I got to thinking, like, is there a good time in a year? Like, is there a better time during the year for an artist to release an album, or does that sort of shit not matter?
Not in December, I would say, is the only like caveat. No, I would say like spring. I don't really know. You know, I'm not an expert in this at all, but it seems like generally like spring to summer is kind of a good sweet spot to put stuff out in.
Yeah, that makes sense. Cause yeah, I feel like whenever I find like those albums right around like the end of summer, or the end of spring, beginning of the summer, those become like my summer albums and I associate summer with. So that makes sense.
Yeah.
I have to talk to you about the Midwife release, Like Author, Like Daughter, because straight up, dude, this is not hyperbole. That has become one of my all-time favorite albums. It is utterly incredible from start to finish. How did you wind up working with Madeline and putting out that record?
So I met Madeline through the Gold Rush Music Festival. When she was recording under the name Sister Grotto. And I remember she had just put out the Minotaur, which is such a beautiful record. And I'd been listening to it. And I remember I had to leave. I had to leave the festival early because I had to catch a flight because I had, like, you know, class on Monday. So I was leaving the venue right as she was playing. And it was like the opening notes of like the Minotaur. No, it was the opening notes to what would later become You Don't Have to Be a House to Be Haunted. And I just like stopped dead in my tracks. And I'm like, I don't care if we're late. Like this, nothing could have moved me from like, you know, just like sort of witnessing her set. So yeah, she later put out that tape, You Don't Have to Be a House to Be Haunted, which is my favorite record of that year. And, you know, I'd gotten to know Maddie. She'd volunteered at the festival that year, and we'd worked together. So I'd reach out to her, and the original plan was I wanted to reissue You Don't Have to Be a House to Be Haunted that came out like the year previous. And she's like, yeah, I mean, that'd be cool. I've also been working on these other songs for this like kind of other project I'm thinking of. And so I'm like, okay. And I was kind of like apprehensive at first because, you know, Sister Grotto, you know, she'd been touring a lot. She kind of had a name. And so I'm like, yeah, let me hear those. And she sent me, you know, these really rough sketches that she'd, you know, recorded in her room at Rhinoceropolis of like Song for an Unborn Son and Liar. And I was just like, oh my God, like even just like, you know, just like these super rough, you know, demos. I was just like, I want, you know, to be like, I want to put this out. This is so good. And so, so we started working together, and then she went up to Olympia to record those songs with Tucker Theodore. And just like once they came back and they were fully fleshed out, you know, with Tucker's really interesting guitar work and, you know, just hearing them kind of in their final form, I was just like, this album is, it's just like it's a gut punch. It's unbelievably good. And so putting that out was, you know, a no-brainer. And it really, it just seemed to immediately like catch people's ears. And, you know, the outpouring of positive responses that I got, not only from, you know, press, but just from listeners who would, you know, email the Bandcamp, you know, page and just talk about how it was playing during really eventful times in their life was really amazing. And, you know, a lot of what went into that record, I don't know how much I really want to get into because it's Maddie's story. And I know that she's been somewhat, you know, reluctant to talk about it, but when it came out, was really, really impactful, just kind of in the context of when it came out. It came out in 2017, and I don't know if you remember the Ghost Ship fire that had happened.
Yep.
Yeah, so it was just right after the Ghost Ship fire, and during that time, right after that, there had been a series of what I believe to be kind of politically motivated closures of DIY spots in a lot of different communities. And so Rhinoceropolis, which was, you know, just a really amazing DIY all-ages venue in Denver that, you know, was like really the epicenter of the, you know, the creative community of Denver. Was basically ratted out on, and the, you know, fire and police came in and shut it down. And Maddie was living there during that time. Same with a lot of really amazing creative, you know, Denver folks. And just overnight, you know, their home and this gathering place of, you know, people who were, you know, putting out really amazing art and just kind of needed each other was gone. And so the songs that were originally kind of fleshed out and written in that place, you know, and were very reminiscent and very, very, like kind of a response to living in Rhinoceropolis, you know, all of a sudden that place was gone. And even in Cincinnati, you know, I felt the effects of that. You know, shortly after that, you know, a really amazing DIY spot was closed down, and because of that, there's like this weirdo bar called Rake's End, which you know, basically was like, you know, anything goes, you know, like harsh noise on like a weeknight to like 2 a.m., you know, type place. And, you know, also like a place where like, you